Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you that there's a small group of men who have the power to print money out of thin air anytime they want, unregulated, unaudited, and they lend that money at extremely high interest to governments and world banks? Well, this is the reality we live in, folks, and this is a power struggle we've been experiencing since the beginning of time, really. But I'm going to start this video off by talking about the inception of America. Because within the inception of America, Alexander Hamilton creates the first bank that does this types of practices. So it'd be 20 years after when Congress disavows it, and it expires in 1811. Well, 1 year after that, chaos ensues, and the UK declares war on the United States, and they engulf the White House in flames. All because the US didn't allow a small group of men to print money behind closed doors anymore. So this war lasted until February 1815. 1 year after the war ends, the second central bank is created. So they were lending money at high interest to the government. President Andrew Jackson wasn't having it, and he destroys the second central bank. He would go on to survive an assassination attempt and be the only president of all time that erased the national debt to zero in America. Unfortunately for America, by the time the Civil War breaks out, America is back to borrowing money. But this time, America was borrowing money from New York banks that were connected to European banks, and they would charge the government interest rates between 12 and as much as 36%. So Abraham Lincoln wasn't having that, and he creates his own currency called greenbacks, and he doesn't have to pay anybody interest for it. Well, 5 days after the war ends, he goes to Ford's Theater. The rest is history. All right, let's take it back to the year 1900 when William McKinley was our president. William McKinley, I think he did pretty okay, if you ask me, because he put the US dollar on the gold standard. By putting the US dollar on the gold standard, the US dollar was backed by gold, and the value of the US dollar was always tied to the value of gold. And citizens could go to their local bank and trade in paper notes for gold in exchange. Unfortunately for the US dollar, 1 year after he signs it, in 1901, this man is let into his rally with a concealed gun, and he shoots him twice in the abdomen, and McKinley dies. Okay, well, in the year 1913, you had 3 business titans who lobbied politicians. These 3 men heavily opposed the creation of another central bank. Unfortunately, they all died when the boat they were taking sank to the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. That boat was funded by J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan had a ticket to board that boat with them, but J.P. Morgan backed out last second, and J.P. Morgan would help create the Federal Reserve Bank the very next year after the Titanic sinks. When Woodrow Wilson, the president, signs the Federal Reserve into existence, he did so on December 23rd when half of the Congress members were on holiday break and couldn't even vote for it. Woodrow Wilson would go on to quote, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by a system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all of our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction, but by the vote, or not by the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." Which pretty much summarizes the Federal Reserve. So, the very next year, World War breaks out. We must understand that war is the most lucrative income for the central bankers because it forces the governments to borrow more money to buy all that ammunition, guns, supplies, tanks, everything, aircraft. And so let's just say the World War One and Two were extremely beneficial for the central bankers. And in 1933, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt demands all gold to be turned into the banks immediately. Anybody found holding gold, any citizen still holding on to gold, would face up to 10 years in prison. And all of the gold was transferred to the Federal Reserve Bank. And the US dollar was no longer backed by gold, making it truly worthless. Just paper that we assign an imaginary value. Meanwhile, the money printers hoard all of the gold. So Senator Huey Long heavily opposed the Federal Reserve. He advocated for an annual income of $5,000 to every citizen. He also helped create the Federal Reserve Reform Act, which would demand each state to have an elected member to observe the Federal Reserve and basically audit them and make sure that they're not being corrupt. Unfortunately, Senator Huey Long was killed in 1935 in his Louisiana State Capitol building. His gunman was instantly killed right after. Neither of them had an autopsy performed, and they had conflicting ballistics reports that conflicted the physical evidence. Congressman Louis McFadden wanted to end the Federal Reserve, and he accused them of having engineered the Great Depression in a 25-minute speech in front of constituents. Unfortunately, Louis McFadden died when he collapsed shortly after a banquet. They ruled his death a heart attack. That's basically what this is, a heart attack. But what's interesting is it occurred shortly after he got home from attending a banquet. President John F. Kennedy would sign an executive order in 1962 or 63, basically stripping away power from the Federal Reserve, allowing the U.S. Treasury to issue silver certificates. Or in other words, the U.S. Treasury can create paper U.S. dollars that are backed by silver, and then it's always tied into the value of silver, preventing inflation. And it also bypasses the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, they wouldn't have to print money because the Treasury is creating the money backed by silver. And with the stroke of a pen, President John F. Kennedy basically declares that the Federal Reserve would soon run out of business. But his plan would not come to fruition because President Kennedy was shot and killed months later. So in 1976, the assistant to Senator Jacob Javits was interviewed. The assistant's name was Harold Rosenthal. So these are Harold Rosenthal's words in a 1976 interview. He states, "Our power has been created through the manipulation of the national monetary system. We authored the quotation, 'money is power.' As revealed in our master plan, it was essential for us to establish a private national bank. The Federal Reserve System fitted our plan nicely since it is owned by us, but the name implies that it is a government institution. From this very outset, our purpose was to confiscate all the gold and silver, replacing them with worthless, non-redeemable paper notes. This we have done." In the same year that he gave this interview, he was shot and killed in a quote-unquote terrorist attack. All right, let's take it to the 80s. Congressman Larry McDonald opposed the Federal Reserve. And in his own words, He stated, "Now you know the why and how of our inflation. You must know what must be done to stop inflation. We must simply end the legal authority which permits the Federal Reserve System to manufacture dollars against the debts and deficits of the federal government." In other words, Congressman Larry McDonald wanted to end the Federal Reserve. Unfortunately, he was killed when his airplane was shot down, and all 269 souls on board died when the airplane accidentally veered into Soviet airspace and Soviet fighters shot it down. All right, let's talk about Thomas Sankara, the leader of Burkina Faso in Africa. Thomas Sankara rejected loans from the IMF Bank, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. These loans, of course, come at great interest. Well, Thomas Sankara was killed shortly after in a coup, and his successor accepted the loans immediately. And ever since then, Burkina Faso has been in debt to the IMF Bank. By the year 2001, very few countries weren't controlled by westernized, usury-based central banks. Two of these countries were Iraq and Afghanistan. All they needed was an excuse. By the year 2009, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya started taking action to create his own currency, a gold-backed African dinar. This dinar was going to be shared by many other African countries, and he already got Nigeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Angola on board, ready to change their currencies and use his gold-backed African dinar, which wouldn't have to take loans from the IMF Bank. Unfortunately, Muammar Gaddafi was killed in 2011 with a NATO-led coalition that staged a civil war in his country. And the Obama administration bombed his country to smithereens. And they bombed his aqueducts and his water salination plants that were turning desert into farmland. Obama destroyed that. And his farmland went back to desert. And to this day in his country, there's an open trade slave market where you can buy a human slave for like $200. So, I mean, fast forward to now, since World War II, all these countries have been bombed by America, and this is not counting covert missions. Like, Italy was bombed in the 80s, but I don't see Italy on this list. Italy was literally bombed by the CIA, in which they blamed it on communist parties. So this list doesn't even involve covert operations. But the point I'm trying to make is most of these are because of central banking. And Iran, for example, we're in war right now with Iran. Usury is outlawed in Iran. Therefore, their central bank doesn't collect any interest. They don't do interest. Neither did Venezuela under Maduro. But any country that goes against the Rothschild affiliated central banks gets bombed or invaded. So that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day as always.